Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Podcast Unflooded, where we talk about all things Wind Waker Unflooded, Zelda, YouTube, Nintendo, and anything that we want. I'm joined once again by special guest Alexander Lathem, my good friend. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, hello. I'm Alexander. I'm happy to be back, and I'm really excited about this podcast. We had done an episode 0 kind of previously. That was just us kind of riffing, trying to stay on topic, but I'm really excited because I think this is going to be a great avenue to talk about Wind Waker Unflooded, talk about Zelda, and talk about like world building and sort of fantasy in general. Maybe someday this will sort of grow beyond that, but for now we're really happy to kind of keep it focused and just, talk about what needs to be talked about.
I totally agree. I guess I want to go ahead and dig into maybe the topic of today's episode. We were talking before the podcast started about kind of different topics that we want to engage in, and I think a great way to start is a general discussion on world building. And I know that there's a lot of people watching the channel that are really creative, and I know that a lot of you have your own Zelda theories and already think about a lot of this stuff, but I think it'd be nice to kind of have a general discussion on, well, how do you think about world building, and especially for those that may be new to the Zelda franchise and maybe intimidated by like the decisions that you make, these big creative decisions. What does it mean to engage in world building, and how do you work with that within the Zelda series that is already so inconsistent with its world building? These are big creative challenges, and I know that Alex does a lot of world building in his own creative works, whether that's scripts he's writing or stories. And I guess, do you want to go ahead and kind of get into your experience with world building and kind of your philosophies there?
Yeah, world building is something I think is very fun, but it is also a very big endeavor, particularly if you're trying to make something on such a massive scale. I think even Hyrule itself, whether it's in Wind Waker, when it's in Wind Waker Unflooded or in Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom, it is quite a large world, and there's a lot you can kind of focus on, and there's a lot to do that maybe, there's a lot that you could do to flesh it out in a way that I think is very satisfying, very fun to explore. That also leads to maybe a lot of pitfalls and then stuff maybe you don't want to do. For me, it's tough because every time I do world building, I'm doing it from a place of an original creation, sort of. And I think Wind Waker Unflooded is unique because it is based off Hyrule, but you have a lot of gaps that you have to fill in, which I think is really fun because in that way you can draw from these other games. Your most recent video, I think, was the Kala Citadel, right, which is a location from these 2 most recent Zelda games. But you're kind of,
as of the recording of this video,
unique way, in a way that you feel fits Wind Waker, and it gives you an opportunity to not just draw from those Zelda games, maybe draw from real life as well. And I don't, at risk of maybe talking too much, I guess just I always like to look at real world examples for anything, whether I'm thinking about like mountain ranges or town names or languages. I mean, these are all different things, but we have such a wealth of resource in our own real world and in our own history. And I always think that's perfectly fine to fall back on.
I totally agree. And that perspective is really informing this project, and we've talked before about different locations that I'm borrowing from, places that I've seen in the real world and places that are special to me, and we can get into that. But even just like within writing in general, we've talked before about, like, I think part of the purpose of storytelling is literally for our own. Can you hear that over the? I think there's a lawnmower out.
Yeah, let's keep the lawnmower in the podcast. But
Yeah. I'm gonna keep talking.
Yeah, keep talking. There's something's happening on my screen that you can't see, but you will see in the editing process. So we're all kind of struggling right now.
Okay, good to know. But yeah, I mean, I think part of the purpose of fiction is to say something about the real world, and that's something that I've been balancing with this project, because it is a I am trying to draw from all that stuff. I am trying to say something about the world and take it seriously and think about realism, because like the project's more interesting when you do that. But it is also a cartoonish world. The Wind Waker is literally a cartoon, and so there's a lot of creative freedom there. And I think that that's part of the fun of world building, right? And you can kind of draw that line wherever you want. Is that you can take it seriously and you can really try to make the world meaningful, so that viewers and or readers or whoever it is are able to get a lot out of it and apply it to their life and compare their own experience and think about how that applies to history. But you can also, like, where do you draw the line of then, well, this is also pure creativity and I can do something new, or the technology doesn't have to be realistic. It can be cartoonish. There could be spaceships. Like, where you can draw those lines in different places.
Yeah. I think it's interesting you kind of mentioned sort of going beyond maybe the initial aesthetic, right? Like, it can be fantasy, but you could have technology to an extent, right? Or to any extent, I guess, right? Like, with Wind Waker, you've got stuff like, the hit sequel, Spirit Tracks, you've got trains. And that can seem sort of out of place in a fantasy world, but I think that's kind of an interesting and unique thing that, when you add it in, opens up a lot of great possibilities for storytelling, for settings and location. And I do encourage it. I've recently been watching the hit television show Adventure Time. And that takes place in sort of a fantasy world, but also a post-apocalyptic one. And so they play around a lot with like magic and science and all these sorts of things. And it gives them a lot of runway to do creative things with that world, tell good stories, have fun characters. And I think Zelda is no different. And I think Hyrule is no different, especially when you think of it as a place that has been reborn and, goes through cycles constantly.
I totally agree. Right. You talk about like post-apocalypticism, and that's something that we see all the time in Zelda. In most of the games, there's some sort of post-apocalyptic nature to it, which is why I think this project is interesting, because it's leading to the apocalypse. And like, my goal for this project is that you can really see it in that moment right before the apocalypse. It's and which I think is, I guess I'm curious to know your take on this idea, right? I even think about like the Star Wars prequels, right? It's like the Republic seems like this great accomplishment, all of history and architecture and government. There are acorns and sticks and leaves falling onto my roof. I don't know if you've heard.
We are under attack, folks. Please support the Patreon, because we are taking heavy fire and we need all the money we can get to send artillery barrages back at these darn acorns and these darn trees. But can you repeat the question, perhaps?
Oh, yeah, what were we talking about? We're talking about post-apocalypticism, and I was talking about Star Wars, because Star Wars shows you a world, just for comparison, it's this shining, maybe not shining, how do I put it? It's like a gilded age, right, in a sense. It's like it looks gold, but it's about to crumble, and that's what we're doing on Wind Waker Unflooded. That's what I'm trying to get to. It's like it seems shiny, but it's all about to fall apart.
Yeah, the like empire on a decline trope is really interesting. We see it in real life with like the various iterations of like the Roman Empire, right? And you see it in Zelda for sure. Yeah, like I think Tears of the Kingdom and Breath of the Wild are showing the aftermath of that. But I think a lot of times, like I think even in Twilight Princess, you could say we're seeing it falling apart, right? We're seeing it kind of before this huge age turns over, right? This cycle, before this cycle starts over again. And I think it's like a really cool thing. I think it's something that is like very fascinating to us as people, because I think maybe a lot of us feel like we are in a state of decline, maybe, or we feel like, there is always a lot of nostalgia for the past. And I think regardless of how you feel, there's aspects where you would maybe look back and say, oh, I wish it was more like this. My cat is acting really crazy. I do apologize. But it's really cool. I've seen it done in a lot of games and stories. Like Star Wars is a great example, right? I think even like Dark Souls showing this world kind of right before it just kind of either is reborn or falls into darkness is a great example. And it is really fascinating, and it makes you as the player or as the viewer kind of engaging and almost feeling like an archaeologist trying to put pieces together and say like, how was it in the past? What led to this? What events? And Zelda, I think, has done a really great job of that, especially with its latest entries.
I totally agree, and I guess I want to talk about what you're getting into there, right, about the apocalypse. I think I sent you a YouTube video a couple weeks ago, Alex. I forget the YouTuber's name, but it was about the apocalypse and why we tell stories about it and why some people want the apocalypse, and that idea of like everyone wants to imagine what would it mean to remake the world. And Wind Waker shows you this example where, all right, the kingdom of Hyrule fell apart, but everyone was able to move on and make something better, and that became a good thing. And I guess I'm curious about your take about, like, what do you think motivates apocalyptic storytelling? And I know we've both written things somewhat in the context of different apocalyptic events in various ways. And I guess I'm curious about some of your projects as well, and what motivates you as a writer.
Yeah. Well, folks, I love apocalypses. That's my campaign slogan. But no, I think apocalypses are great settings for stories, either right before or long after. And I think the best apocalypses do try to look at big picture stuff like humanity and civilization and society and culture and politics, and sort of how that is shaped and how we are shaped by them, how we shape them themselves. And I think a great example are some of the like earlier Fallout games are really great at looking at a society that is sort of feels so burdened by its past, feels so like maybe things can't change, or maybe we are sort of, almost slaves to these certain ideologies or beliefs, but also at the same time saying, well, maybe that's not true. Maybe, we can look towards the future. I think Fallout 2 and New Vegas especially kind of do these tropes really well, these ideas. And I think just any good apocalyptic media is going to try to tackle that like big picture stuff.
Right. No, I totally agree. Yeah, I guess I'm curious too, within your own writing, even, I guess, like, I definitely agree that there's a lot of power there in analyzing a society and thinking about, like, apocalypses give you an example of how to restructure that. But I guess I'm curious about the micro stories within that too, and I think that's why Wind Waker really shines to me. Like the original game is like, you have this young boy on this island, and in the game it's like, I mean, you're told immediately through the prologue some of the events of the world, and that it's kind of recovering within the wake of this great apocalypse. But it's also presented as a kind of paradise. And it's like, from the ashes of this old kingdom burdened by monarchy and monsters, this really kind of paradise arose. And maybe it doesn't last, until a giant bird arrives. But I don't know. I guess I'm curious about, like, is that the thing? Is this idea that, if we can just get rid of all the things that weigh us down, I don't know. I think it's interesting too, because Wind Waker doesn't, like, at the end of the game, you move on from that. The Great Sea was nice, but they still have to form a new kingdom. And I guess I'm just curious about what you think about some of that stuff.
Yeah. I guess there's a lot there. Yeah. I want to talk about, like, I think there is this sort of tendency to be like, oh, if, a lot of us maybe do want that apocalypse, because I think we want to be able to maybe be free of certain aspects, free of like having to go to a job for a paycheck and just say, I'm going to take it into my own hands, right? I'm going to have my Mad Max moment. I'm going to become a lone warrior who kind of, does as he pleases and whatnot. And I like that you mentioned like microcosm too, because I think I mentioned big ideas in apocalypse stories, but I think the best way to sometimes do that is to start with smaller stories, start with little groups of people, and kind of build on that. And not only are we talking about the story of, young Link and his missing sister, but we're also talking about like Hyrulean society in general, right? And sort of, the sins of the ages past. And you can just do all kinds of cool stuff with that. And I guess in terms of my own writing, like, it's tough because I'm someone who struggles with sort of scale. I want to do big things, and I think sometimes it's like I get a little too big for my britches, so to speak. And that is a pitfall you can kind of fall into, where you have these really big ideas, but how do you tell a compelling story with those ideas? And I think you have to kind of center it and focus it on smaller players at first. I think you could tell these great stories of empires declining, but really you have to focus it on these few main characters. And I think that's what Zelda does really well.
Mm-hmm. No, I totally agree, right? Because ultimately, it's stories have to be about the people involved in them. And I mean, I think about some of the conversations we had, just to concretely compare it to some of the things that we've worked on together. Some of our first really, I feel like, in-depth world building conversations came from working on Star Boys together. And, I think about during that, it's like we spent a good bit of time figuring out this kind of government/company that Fartham and Quigley, the main characters, work for. They're space explorers, and they work for this kind of, to me, it's like, if America took over the world, that's what this government is. And that's that's what defines its interests. And we don't find out a lot. We talked a lot about lore and potential kind of things like that would kind of like result from that. But I think, you know, there's a lot of like stuff that did not end up in the script as far as like referencing that detail, but it was evident through the character relationships, through how they talk to each other and how they talk to their commanding officers. And it's like through that, you still got a sense for the bigger picture through the smaller picture. And I guess I'm curious about what you think about that. It's like sometimes you don't even have to show the larger world. And I think Wind Waker does this too, right? It's like by showing you a small part of it, that gives you an idea of the larger world.
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned Star Wars, because I think that is a good example of like, even if you're not going to show it, and even if you're not going to, you know, it's not maybe going to come into play until later or at all, it is totally worth it, I think, to kind of flesh that out and decide, like, because it can help you make writing decisions further along when you're writing a script and you're like, oh, like, I need this character to go to this place, right? I need character A to go to location A. And it's like, well, you know, based on this world building I've done, maybe this person B is from location B, and these mesh, you know, really well, and it's like, oh, I have a reason now, and it doesn't just feel like a MacGuffin. It feels like, oh, this feels like within the world, it makes sense that this character A is going to place A because of character B. And I know I'm throwing out letters and characters here, but I think it's genuinely worth doing, because it can just help you with that writing process. And Starboys was really interesting because, yeah, we did a lot of kind of imagining what the world would look like, and it was something that, like, yeah, we didn't explicitly show it very much, but what was shown was, yeah, through Farther and Quigley interacting with General Motors, and you get a sense of, like, you know, this is not a maybe great organization. This is sort of a place that is sort of a...
General Motors is a character.
Not the car company, and please do not sue us, but, like, General Motors is a hilarious character on Star Boys. Please check out the Star Boys series. And it's these interactions that I think I find are so funny, because I think we even talked about how maybe in the Star Boys world, like, there had been sort of like a militarization of the government, right?
Right.
And that generals were sort of running various state departments, right? You would have like a general of agriculture or general of defense, which makes more sense, but and so there is this sort of like, with General Motors, his character, he's this sort of like goofy, like, he almost seems like a goofy drill sergeant, which seems kind of like an oxymoron. But I do think a lot of like the scripts were aided by those early days where we were kind of had a document. We were saying like, oh, what if like this place was like this, and it was because of this. And I feel for certain that, you know, games like Zelda have similar kind of instances where they're kind of fleshing out why the world works. And from there, they can help, you know, create quest lines, or create dialogue, create items even, you know. So yeah, I mean, I guess all this to say, like, world building is definitely a worthwhile endeavor.
I totally agree, right? And I guess that's the thing, right? Is like, I bring all this up to say is like, when I'm working on this project and I'm 3D modeling these locations, I'm making decisions about where things go, and all of that stuff comes from this kind of idea that the developers left clues to inform those decisions. And I do think that they did. I think that they crafted this world with care, and even though we only saw part of it, a small part of the world, I think like they left clues where you can imagine the greater world. And I don't think they, like, you know, I don't think they had everything planned out. And I don't know, maybe there was a whole map that like they did draw that we just never got to see. I don't know. I don't think it was like as detailed as the Breath of the Wild map and the whole thing got cut. But I do think there's a lot of connecting tissue that isn't explicitly said in game that we can pick up from and connect these dots, and that can inform the project. And I think it's like you said, it's a result of that work of thinking about, you know, this is Hyrule. There is a, you know, Kokiri Forest. What does that turn into? Death Mountain. What does that turn into? There are these rough ideas, and you can think about what's in between them. And, you know, that is still informing the map of the Great Sea. There are things they thought about, you know, even if it's, you know, there is still a lot of filling in the gaps at the same time. So it is guesswork, but it's also creative. And it's, you know, it's like, I'm not just trying to figure out what were the developers going for. I am also going for, and what can I add on to that as well?
Mm-hmm. I think a great example is like Hyrule Castletown, and how you've imagined it is this very like it's the town that surrounds the castle, as the name implies. But it's like, well, what kind of people live there? Well, probably like very wealthy people who help maintain, the kingdom and are of the upper echelon of that class system. And so you added like an opera house, right? Which I thought was really cool, and like a theater, because it's like, yeah, I think they would have these kind of really nice amenities that you wouldn't see on such a scale, or if at all, in sort of the rural Hyrule area. And so I've seen you really build it up and talk about like, oh, let's have a university. We're going to have this really nice naval dockyard at some point. And I mean, that's something that I think is sort of kind of new to Zelda, if I'm not mistaken, where I don't know if we really see, outside of maybe the cartoon and the CDI games, like nobility in Hyrule and how they live. And so that's really neat. And that's a really great thing, where it's like you were brainstorming this sort of, this world building project, this Wind Waker Unflooded, saying like, well, what do I want to do with Castletown? I don't want to just copy and paste it from, oh, let me just look at how Breath of the Wild's ruins look and let me just kind of fix them up. You really thought about how it would work if it was real. And that's something that I think is what can make or break a great story or great world, that can make a player or anyone feel invested enough to say, I want to look into this, as if they were a historian in the real world looking into like a real world kingdom.
I appreciate that. I'm trying to do that, and Castletown has a long way to go. But like, that is, I guess that's what I want to encourage and inspire and motivate, because I believe that that's what these original Zelda locations do. I think a great example within Zelda games are the dungeons, because those are things that often don't get a lot of lore around them. Sometimes you just kind of walk in and you look around and you're like, well, I don't really know where I am. But, I think especially in games like Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess and even Wind Waker, those are games where you kind of like have to piece together the story of where you are. You don't know what Wind Waker's Earth Temple really is, but you see all these graves and crypts. And there's also these mirror-based puzzles, and it's like, is this like, this feels like it's a evolution of like the Gerudo Spirit Temple from Ocarina of Time because of these mirror puzzles, and there's these snake statues, and maybe there's that, but it's in this part of the world, and I like you're trying to put the pieces together, and all you have are clues. It's not dialogue. It's just like I see the ruins themselves, and I'm trying to figure out the story there. And I guess I really like what you're talking about, because that's really what I'm trying to go for, is that experience. Because to me, like, that's so much of what I love about Zelda, is that experience. And that's why I recommend it to viewers at home. If you want a good blog to read, look up, I think it's just called The Architecture of Zelda. And it's all about answering those kinds of questions, looking at different places throughout the series. I really recommend this blog. The work that they do is like, this is exactly the way I want to think about about Zelda maps.
Link in the description down below, maybe.
Yeah, remind me to do that.
I will remind you.
But it's just a great, like, really in-depth analysis of just so many different locations from the Zelda series, and going like, okay, we see this from the architecture, we don't know much about the story, what can we infer about the history of this location based on what we see?
Yeah. And I think that's a great thing, is like with projects, and I think it could go for any medium, whether it's a book or, whether it's written or whether it's audio or visual or both, just leaving something there for you to like be able to ponder and be like, oh, this reminds me of this, and like, how does this connect, is great stuff. I mean, I think it's really fun to do. And I think, yeah, like a lot of Zelda fans, I think, as we've seen with a lot of great like Zelda YouTuber videos, saying like, well, let's analyze what's up with Poe and these Poe statues, or like, what do these ruins represent? What was this location used for? I think it is something that genuinely like fascinates a lot of people. And I think it's really great that, you can sort of say, well, I'm going to look at all this, and then I'm going to try to just like build that world, right? And show it in a way. But I guess, yeah, like in terms of if you're doing your own project and you are doing this kind of post-apocalyptic, or, post-apocalyptic, maybe it's been a long time after the apocalypse, or maybe it's even right before, just great visual hooks, like you mentioned with the temple and sort of how that connects to a previous game. That's awesome, I think, and that's like a great way to do it, without making it heavy-handed, and saying like, oh, I found a tablet in this temple that says like, this is the same temple from Ocarina of Time. Like,
Right.
it's and that's not in and of itself maybe a bad thing. I think there's a way to even tell that, but I think just leaving it just to kind of player interpretation and imagination by sprinkling little things here and there, I think that's definitely the way to go.
I totally agree, and that impacts the way that I approach scripts and writing is just that idea. And I want to be better about that, because this is an issue I have with scripts, is like I want to put that in the dialogue. I want characters to look at each other and go, oh yeah, this is all connected to the ancient ruins that are like, oh, very interesting. And it's like there's some things you just can't say, and like you just have to leave to the environment to speak for itself. And Zelda just does such a good job of that, and that is inspiring. It's like this project is only possible because that inspires me. And I don't know. It's like it's if there's any reason that I do this project, it's not just a love for Zelda, but it is like by analyzing this, by digging into this, it helps me learn more about world building and storytelling, and like how to show a story through an environment. And like that's really what I kind of want to pick up from doing this project. It's like being better at all that environmental storytelling, that visual storytelling. So it's like I'm approaching this as a Zelda fan, as someone who loves Wind Waker, as someone who's always imagined this, but I think like this is almost a class for me in a way. It's all about like what lessons can I learn and get closer to the Wind Waker and figure out how were they inspiring their decisions that affected their models for the map, and how can I take that and help that improve my own ability.
Yeah, I think this has been an exciting project just because like I do imagine in the future, like when you're done, what you'll be able to say you learned, and maybe you'll say, oh, I want to make my own original fantasy world now. Or like maybe for your next project you say, oh, I really know how I want to build this location or create this group of characters thanks to this. I think it's been already pretty invaluable. I mean, you talked to me about how much you felt like you've learned, and I'm sure you shared with the audience, and I think our previous Q&As about how you almost still feel like a beginner in a lot of ways with this stuff. Like it feels like it is just, there's so much still to learn. And I guess just like, I'm not one to give advice, right? But I think for anyone who is interested in world building, right, and wants to create a world, it sounds this may sound like duh, but I think the best thing is just to kind of go out and try and do it. Like whether it's a modeling project or whether you've got a Google Doc and you want to be like, this is continents and countries and all these little subsections that you can fill out. Like, I think just going for it, because I think you learn a lot. I know in me and myself, I've done multiple world building projects that like maybe will never see the light of day, but I'm like, oh, from now on, I know how I want to do things in the future.
I totally agree. I do think that's all the time we have for today. Alex, thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you all so much for watching. I'm going to start wrapping up the video. I think we've covered some great stuff.
We've done it, folks. We've done it. So yeah, thanks for having us. Thanks for listening to us ramble on about things. Let us know what you think, please, in the comment section down below. And if you have any suggestions or any questions for us, I mean, it'd be great if we could have like a Q&A each episode. I think that'd be really fun.
Subscribe for more, and y'all know how to support me as a creator. I say it in every video, so I'm not gonna repeat it here. But do become a member on Patreon and listen to my music on Spotify. That's JoeKendrick. That's on Spotify, Apple Music. I do soundtrack style stuff, and if you like The Legend of Zelda and its soundtracks, you may like the kind of stuff I do. So feel free to check that out. Links in the description. I'll let you go.
Wouldn't want to be. But thank you, folks, and have a wonderful day, evening, or night.